This video was brought to you by Brilliant. Since returning to power in Afghanistan 3 years ago, the Taliban have quickly reimposed their severe and oppressive policies, ignoring the demands and condemnation of the international community. On foreign policy, however, the Taliban are attempting to chart a different course by trying to end their diplomatic isolation and boost their international engagement. And on this front, they're starting to rack up successes. So in this video, we're going to explain why more and more countries are beginning to engage with the Taliban government, looking at security, economic, and humanitarian engagement, as well as discussing whether the West's approach also needs to change. Before we start, if you haven't already, please consider subscribing and ringing the bell to stay in the loop and be notified when we release new videos. To get things started, we're going to do a quick refresher on the Taliban's return to power. Now, the Taliban previously ruled Afghanistan from 1996 to 2001, imposing their strict interpretation of Sharia law, and were recognized by only 3 countries: Pakistan, Saudi Arabia, and the United Arab Emirates. The Taliban were ousted from power by the US-led invasion of 2001, but then regrouped and launched a 2-decade-long insurgency against the new US-backed government and remaining coalition forces. Eventually, though, the Doha Accord, agreed in 2020 by the US and Taliban, set the groundwork for the US's withdrawal from Afghanistan. And as American forces pulled out, the Taliban quickly retook parts of the country in a lightning offensive, recapturing control of the capital of Kabul in August 2021, and declaring the re-establishment of the Islamic Emirate of Afghanistan. Despite their deeply oppressive regime in the 90s, the Taliban of the 2020s made several claims seeking to reassure the world that things would be different this time. The general approach taken by the international community was to refuse recognition of the Taliban government and freeze assets and aid until the Taliban acted on their commitments to respect human rights. Now, in case this wasn't already obvious, the Taliban have not lived up to those commitments and are instead ruling with the same brutality, including, as the UN says, a system of total discrimination, exclusion, and subjugation of women and girls that may amount to gender apartheid, as well as the oppression of other minorities and actors. In fact, the Taliban's policies have resulted in a, quote, continuous, systematic, and shocking rescinding of a multitude of human rights, including the rights to education, work, and the freedoms of expression, assembly, and association. Naturally, this has been met with significant international condemnation. Still, no country officially recognizes the Taliban regime, and it remains cut off from huge amounts of money and assets. Despite this, however, the Taliban has been gradually boosting its international, particularly regional, engagement. Now, for countries in the Central Asian region, security is perhaps the top priority for engaging with the Taliban. Since transitioning from an insurrection to a government, the Taliban now finds itself on the other side of a violent extremist insurgency, as the Islamic State Khorasan province, or ISK group, wages a fight against the Taliban regime. ISK have carried out attacks across Afghanistan and also fought pitched battles against the Taliban, but is also a significant and growing international threat. ISK was linked to bombings in Iran in January that killed more than 100 people, and carried out the attack in Moscow in March that killed more than 140, to name but a few. It's unsurprising then that nearby and more distant states see security cooperation with the Taliban as a necessity. Russia is even considering removing the Taliban from its list of terrorist groups, something that Kazakhstan and Kyrgyzstan have already done. Meanwhile, reports suggest that the US is considering sharing more information with the Taliban on shared security concerns. On top of this, China, which was the first country to accept the diplomatic credentials of a Taliban envoy, wants to cooperate with the Taliban on tackling the separatist East Turkestan Islamic movement, and sees a stable Taliban-led Afghanistan as a better neighborly option than a volatile and fractious one. Other countries like Kazakhstan and the United Arab Emirates have also accepted Taliban diplomatic envoys, while making clear that it does not amount to an official recognition of legitimacy. Further afield, Germany, seeking to take a tougher stance on security and immigration, deported dozens of Afghans back to Afghanistan last month for the first time since the Taliban took power, something that rights groups have criticized as helping to normalize the Taliban regime, though the deportation was facilitated without talking directly to the Taliban, using Qatar as a mediator instead. Security factors aren't the only reason why the Taliban has been able to boost its international engagement, though. Economic opportunities have also proven key. An early example of this was a deal signed in May 2022 by the Taliban for a UAE-based firm to manage 3 international airports in Afghanistan, beating Qatar and Turkey to the job. More lucrative, however, is Afghanistan's rich resources, like precious metals and minerals, with estimates valuing the country's untapped deposits at $1 trillion. In January of this year, the Taliban government signed its first major public commodities extraction deal, a 25-year contract for a Chinese company to extract oil from Afghanistan's north, with the company investing $150 million a year, increasing to $540 million in 3 years. With a view to China's growing electric vehicle industry, another Chinese company is reportedly offered to invest $10 billion to access Afghanistan's lithium deposits. Then, just last month, the Taliban finalized a trade and investment deal with Uzbekistan, apparently worth $2.5 billion. So, evidently, some countries view engagement with the Taliban as a pragmatic move, a security necessity and economic opportunity. But what about humanitarian engagement? Well, there's no doubt that Afghanistan is in desperate need. According to the UN, nearly 24 million Afghans, that's more than half of the country's population, are projected to need humanitarian assistance this year, and funding coverage for the humanitarian response is only about 25%. Even though the Taliban remain officially unrecognized and largely isolated, subject to sanctions, asset freezes, and banking restrictions, Western countries have still directed billions of dollars, though apparently not enough, into Afghanistan via the UN and agencies on the ground in order to try and alleviate this humanitarian crisis. The major challenge for Western countries continuing to refuse engagement with the Taliban is this isolation strategy simply hasn't been working. The Taliban has given no indication that it will U-turn on any of its deeply oppressive policies, and in some cases have effectively doubled down on them. For example, a recent law that obliges women to conceal their voices in public, not just their faces and bodies. As such, questions are being raised as to whether Western nations, without recognizing the Taliban regime, should pursue engagement with the Taliban, at least on a case-by-case basis, in order to more effectively tackle the humanitarian crisis and try to improve the situation for women, girls, and other minorities. This is something the various aid and development agencies have called for as the best, or perhaps least worst option, given the lack of success of the current strategy and the fact that the Taliban's control of Afghanistan is a reality. The obvious problem, though, is that there's no guarantee that a greater engagement will encourage the Taliban to change their ways, and it may instead go some way to normalize the regime. With issues like these, it's often hard to come to the right conclusions. So if you want to improve your decision making, you'll want to check out Brilliant. Brilliant is where you learn by doing, with thousands of interactive lessons in maths, data analysis, programming, and AI. For instance, there's the Scientific Thinking course, which takes you on an interactive tour of our physical world. You'll engage with key scientific principles and theories, from simple machines like gears and pulleys to Einstein's special theory of relativity. It's not just a bunch of lectures either. You'll learn by doing, with hands-on lessons that will have you comparing circuits to understand voltage and current, playing snooker to learn the rules of collision, planning your itinerary for an intergalactic music festival on a space-time diagram, and more. That way, you'll build your natural intuition while gaining deep knowledge of scientific principles. Find out more and try everything Brilliant has to offer for a full 30 days by visiting brilliant.org/TLDR or by clicking the link in the description. That way, you'll also get 20% off an annual premium subscription. Thanks for your support, and thanks to Brilliant for sponsoring this video.